Today, our featured speaker is Lezlie. I want to speak for a moment a little bit about who Lezlie is, and then I'll turn it over to her and her presentation. So Lezlie Harper is the operator of Niagara Bound Tours, a Black History tour company located in St. Catharines, Ontario. Lezlie is a fifth-plus generation Black Canadian whose family came to Canada in 1851, settling in Fort Erie. She also has ancestors that were here earlier that she will speak about. This has been a constant learning journey for Lezlie as she enters her 19th year of offering these tours to people she has hosted from around the world, as well as many motor coaches from the U.S. She also enjoys working with others on telling the Black history story. At present, she sits on the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, which is dedicated to preserving these historic sites throughout the state. She is also working with other U.S. states to establish a Harriet Tubman Trail that will end up in Ontario. So please join me in welcoming Lezlie.
Hi.
Hello.
So nice to be here, and thank you so much for having me here today. I get to do my favorite thing.
We're all set for you. The slides have switched over to yours, and away you go, Lezlie. So
I can begin. Well, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today, and happy Black History Month. It's a subject that it took me a long time to appreciate my history in this country. I grew up in in Fort Erie, a very small town on the border of the U.S., and felt rather insignificant, if you will, because Black history wasn't talked about. It wasn't explored. When I was born, I knew the term Underground Railroad, but I didn't know the story. And it was almost from the moment I could talk, I asked, were we part of the Underground Railroad? And my family's response, sadly, was, never mind that, you're here now. And that could have been many reasons. Many families here, particularly in Ontario, they know their history. My family, although they didn't talk about it, we had a family Bible. But as far as knowing the history, that didn't happen until much later. The community of Fort Erie discovered, it seemed, if you could discover it, since we'd already been there for such a long time, Black history, they thought, at a building in Fort Erie they thought was a safe house, and things seemed to evolve from there, but they weren't accepting oral history. And my grandma passed away before I was born, but some of her siblings were still alive, and her brother, my great uncle Kit, was the one that I spoke to and asked him to talk about the history. He shared some stories with me, but I still sort of regret not going after him for more. He lived into his 90s and his mind was clear until the day he died. And I wish I had taken more time to learn more. But what he gave me was oral, and everything he told me has come through in documentation, which is just I'm so grateful for. So one of the things I want to tell you is that I hope that you will interact with me and ask me questions. This is your time. The world has become quite polarized with opinions and what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And I don't see how we're ever going to get through all the issues we have today unless we can feel free and comfortable to ask questions. So I'll start by telling you I'm not politically correct because I can't get it right. So please have no worries. There are no questions that are stupid or don't be uncomfortable is what I'm trying to tell you. And this also, when I talk about Black history, it's not about what the white people did to the Black people, because I believe all cultures and races have their own situation that they have to atone for, if you will. Pardon me, I'm dealing with a little bit of allergies today, so if I sneeze or cough, please excuse me. But I'm really proud to say that I am a Canadian, and I'm also proud to say that I am a descendant of an enslaved individual. So the first slide I want to show you, and will you indulge me one more moment? Something I do on all of my tour, when I get on a tour bus, it's just anxiety. It started out an anxiety thing that I just did for myself, but it's something I share with everyone now. when I first started doing my tours, I tried to keep God out of it because I was trying to be politically correct. But the thing is, the more I got into it, I realized that the people I talk about, they were all faith-based. And of course, that's something that's in my family for sure. I'm still under construction as a Christian, but I try. And so I say this little prayer before I start, and you can call it a meditation. It's just a little thing I do, and then it relieves my anxiety. So if you'll indulge me. Dear Lord in heaven, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to this group today. And as always, Lord, I ask you now to use my voice to speak the words these people need to hear. Amen. See, very short. But the thing about it is that if you don't like what I say now, you can't blame me. You got to blame God. So now I'm free to say whatever I want to say. So the first picture I'd like to share with you, this is my family. Family and friends, a family wedding. I don't have a pointer on this machine. I apologize for that. But it was at a family wedding. The woman with the headband on in the middle, that's my great aunt Alice. And the man behind her, sort of diagonal between the two ladies, that's the groom, my Uncle Roy. He looks really happy, doesn't he? The other woman in white was my grandma. That's my grandma, bright and she pretty. And then if you look at the top, there's a baby. And that baby is being held by my Uncle Jim, these great Uncle Jim. And that baby is my mom. And so that picture would have it was a family wedding in around the 1920s. And those faces, some of those faces looked into the eyes of the enslaved. My uncle Jim and my Uncle Roy and my Uncle Kit's up there somewhere. I believe there he is. I can see him. They all looked into the eyes of the enslaved that were descendants of, because they were the grandchildren of the enslaved. Just think, they lived here, and at the time they lived here, nobody wanted to talk to them because it wasn't written down. What a waste. It's so sad. I'm so glad that's changed. There is something that they accept oral history now, which is great. Because in the case of Uncle Kit, he was bang on, as I said before. But they looked into the eyes of the enslaved. So that may have been why they didn't want to share the history. Too painful, too close, maybe, for them to talk about. But anyway, the lives that these people would have led, they're all Canadian. There may be a smattering of people who came from Buffalo, but I don't think so. Geographically, I don't think it would have been easy for them to get to the venue where this was in Fort Erie. It was out in the country in Fort Erie at the time, but the Peace Bridge wouldn't have been built yet. Well, no, the Peace Bridge would have just been built, but I don't know if there's Americans there or not. Anyhow, these are my relatives and family friends that are attending a wedding, and what they went through, how they had to, what they worked, they lived their lives. They led very simple lives. They were very much faith-based, and they were resilient to their environment. There were certain things they never even thought about, but I'm proud to say these are my relatives, and I'm looking at them today, and I could almost cry looking at them because I'm looking at the same screen you are, and I'm just sort of looking at their faces and thinking about what they're thinking about. Just an amazing group of people, but these are the authentic. I call them the authentic Blacks of Canada. So that's my family. This next place, this is what I call, when I first started the tour, I called it the Crossing Point Tour. And this is where many Blacks would have first crossed into Canada. And that's Black Rock, was called Black Rock on the other side of the water. That's the Niagara River. And across is Black Rock, which is now called Buffalo. And this side is Fort Erie. Before they built the Peace Bridge, there were only ferry boats that would cross back and forth. So there were many, many crossings here. And I'll show you a picture of all the many crossings. The one that, there's two that are marked Forsyth, but we're looking at the one Forsyth Birdie Street. And so all these crossings, and that not that far, just the Niagara River in Fort Erie, they had all of these various crossings, because the Peace Bridge wasn't built until 1927. So anyway, this is a very important site to me. I also have it in the background, as you can see, for my camera. And People ask me, did people swim that river? You have to see it sometimes to believe it. It has one of the fastest running currents in the world. And yeah, people did swim that river. One of the people who swam that river was a man by the name of Oliver Parnell from Niagara Falls, who ended up in Niagara Falls. He ended up being a very successful businessman. What I ask people to do when I'm talking about this history is just give yourself a moment to critically think about what I've just said about this man. He swam the Niagara River. He had been a freedom seeker, I believe, out of Virginia. So that meant he came up from Virginia, whether he was assisted or not. We don't know. I don't know. But he made it up from Virginia, swam across the river holding on to a suitcase. The Niagara River, fastest running current, one of the fastest running currents in the world. And you'd have to swim it on a diagonal. I grew up in this area, so I don't know how to swim, but many of my friends would jump off the Peace Bridge and they would swim it on an angle. Did someone tell him how to swim it on an angle? I don't know. But somehow he made it across, a freedom seeker. And because when Blacks first arrived in Canada, their intentions were to put a roof over their head, food in their stomach, build their churches, have nothing to do with the white man's government, which made them conservatives. A lot of people get upset when you talk about conservatism now. But when you think about it historically for Black people during the time of slavery, it made sense. Governments were run by white people. You wouldn't want to have anything much to do with those people who had enslaved you and beat you and tore your family apart. So it made sense to stay out of the way of the government when you came to Canada. Just leave that alone. Let's just do our own thing and let the white man handle his government, and we'll do our own thing. Not all people felt that way, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, but people were very independent. So Oliver Parnell, he proceeded to operate his own business. Can you imagine? He didn't have an MBA. He just started his own entrepreneurial business and was very successful. He used to partner with a man by the name of Burr Plato, who was also a formerly enslaved person from the United States. And Burr Plato was even more interesting. Besides being a successful businessman, he also sat on the Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada Town Council. He was a politician, a formerly enslaved person. This is why we celebrate Black History Month, and we celebrate those people that came before. And I certainly celebrate my family, and I celebrate all those people that came here literally with nothing, not even dignity in a lot of ways, just a desire to be free. I have a saying for people in my area that landed on this site, that stayed in this area. I don't like to speak for Niagara Falls even, or St. Catharines, but the people who were my family and the people who lived in the area, I have a saying for them. It's, we're here, we's free, we's done. Very simply, just that's, they weren't looking at becoming entrepreneurs, most of them. I know there was a candy store up by Lake Erie that my Uncle Kit talked about, and there's more information to come out about that person later. Not in this talk, but when I have a chance to do some more research. So there was a bit of entrepreneurship, but it was mostly labor and agriculture. And my great uncles were involved in the railroad or working for the town, whatever. And fortunately, they were able to make a good living and have good pensions and just lived out their simple lives. So there were some famous people that came through this site. And I'll talk about one right now. And that was, I'll go ahead a little bit. This was him. What a handsome devil, eh? This is Josiah Henson, better known to the world as Uncle Tom. Now, there's been a whole bunch of, there's been a change in the Underground Railroad Uncle Tom Cabin Museum in Dresden, which stresses me out to no end. I could actually cry a little bit. How come this, there we go. I forgot you had said there was a little bit of a delay, eh, Tom? I'm looking at my phone to see what they're seeing and I'm seeing. So now we're on the right slide. Whew, okay, it was almost like my phone was possessed.
We told you, Lezlie, don't worry
Yeah,
about
I
the
forgot.
YouTube
I'm like,
channel. That's our
uh-oh,
job.
my phone is possessed. So anyway, I'm a little distressed at what's happening with the new revisionist history that's coming out. And we're not just, and there's people that are going into Ontario archives now, and they're calling it updating, and that's fine. I'm thrilled when people want to bring in more information, but it's when they want to take something out and it's done in a subjective manner that I get upset. And Uncle Tom, I always have taken such great pleasure in bringing people down here to the river site where I talk about Uncle Tom, and I talk about who he is and what he's all about. When I finish, because what happened is Black people had a tendency to call each other Uncle Toms. And it was supposed to be the ones who kissed up to the massa. Oh, massa, you so smart. Oh, you so good. Oh, massa, you want to know something? Like, that's who they portrayed Uncle Tom as being. But if you ever read the book, which I highly recommend, when people ask me, what do you recommend? There's so many out there. I have one of the finest unread libraries of Black history books you'd ever want to imagine. But when you ask me for just one off the top of my head, I say Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was the first. And you read about Uncle Tom in the book. Wonderful man. He was so helpful to people. Josiah Henson, who was, the character used as Uncle Tom, Josiah Henson, unbelievable man. And I'm going to tell you his whole history. There's no shame in the term Uncle Tom. It's only playing up to the ignorant when we have changed the name of the museum in Dresden, in my humble opinion. And I've been to his site in I just came back from the farm where he lived in Maryland, and I shared this information with the people that operate the place there. They were quite surprised because when the book Uncle Tom was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman, who was aware of slavery, wasn't affected by it at all until she was in the South and she happened upon a slave market. It was her aha moment. And she was haunted by the sights of the slave market and how these people who had a different skin color than her, but how they were treated like you would go to a stock, a cattle stock auction or a horse auction, checking teeth. And many of the people whom she would see may have been a family and were able to stay together through that horrendous trip from Africa. But now all of a sudden, mothers, fathers, children were being separated from one another. The anguish of that would be incredible. And when she saw that, she could no longer ignore what the circumstances really were. So she wrote this book, and it was rudimentary written. But what it did was it brought what George Floyd did for racism in 2020, the awareness of what racism was about. This book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, brought around the awareness about slavery. It brought more people in as abolitionists, I understand. It certainly raised the consciousness of people to understand it. It was the second best-selling book in the world after the Bible. How can you want to delete something that was so powerful? I don't understand how that could be done. But they have changed the name of the museum in Dresden. I just hope that people recognize it as quickly as they would have when it was just Uncle Tom's Cabin Museum. It's now called Josiah Henson Museum of African Canadian History. But there really was in my mind, there really wasn't any reason to change the name. Just as I'm proud of the real person, Josiah Henson, we can be just as proud of the character that this white woman wrote about so many years ago. And I remember I read the book when I was younger, and there's a young girl in it named Topsy. And I remember when I read it when I was younger, I was embarrassed by Topsy because she seemed so silly. But when I read the book as an adult, I revisited my thoughts of Topsy, and I cried for her because when you think about it, she never knew she could have a mother and a father. Even little dogs and little kittens and animals, they have their mommies in the beginning of their lives usually. But here, this young human little girl never knew that she could have a mommy and a daddy, because she was one of those children who were produced to be enslaved. Such a sad, sad thought. And that's what Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about. So I don't know where the shame comes in. And if you're not comfortable calling your Black brothers and sisters Uncle Tom, then don't do it. That's all. Just carry on. So anyway, Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson was a noble and wonderful man. He was born in Maryland on the Western Shores. And I remember years ago when I went one of my first trips to Maryland, I said, why is it you guys always talk about Harriet Tubman? And my tourism colleagues, I was asking, you always talk about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but you don't talk about Josiah Henson. And they said, oh, that's because he's Western Shore. Both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass come from the Eastern Shores of Maryland. And I'm happy to say now that they've all of a sudden they've caught up with the Western Shore and Josiah Henson. They have a wonderful visitor center down in Rockville, Maryland, Montgomery County. When I was there, they were just starting to work on it. They have an archaeological dig going on to see if they can dig up a slave's quarter that existed on property. The house is there that you can go in and visit. And it's the house where Josiah Henson, after having left Canada, came back to see his mother once again years later. And Josiah Henson's story is incredibly interesting. And although not born in Canada, I consider him a Canadian, and I'm happy to adopt him. Anyway, he was born in Maryland, and at 5 years old, he witnessed something no child should ever see. 5 years old. His father had been like a cheerleader on the farm. And the reason I call it a farm is when they're smaller, they're called farms. When they're larger, they're called plantations. I used to think it was a way that they were avoiding the term. They didn't want to say plantation, but no, it's just, it's basically that was smaller. So he was on a farm. Anyway, his father was the cheerleader of the farm, kept people's spirits up, kept them moving with song and jokes and cheering them up. Good man. And but the overseer on the farm, that's the supervisor, was hitting on his wife. So Josiah's father went over to deal with this white overseer, hitting on his wife. And in those days, a Black man wasn't allowed to touch a white man. And Josiah's dad did a little more than that. So he was going to be punished. They brought the people in from that farm as well as other farms, and proceeded to whip his father 50 times. When Josiah's dad didn't die, they whipped him another 50 times. And when he didn't die, they nailed his ear to a tree and chopped off his ear. He didn't die. Somehow he recovered, but his spirit never did. He was a broken man. He never recovered from that. And Josiah witnessed that of his daddy. Can you imagine? His father was eventually sold off to another farm, and Josiah never saw his father again. But what was inside of Josiah kept him going, because he kept his faith. He kept moving along. He eventually became the overseer on the farm, which sounds like it wouldn't happen. But what would happen is the plantation and or farm owner would appoint Blacks from time to time as overseers, so then the work would be done better. If the instructions were coming from an overseer who was also enslaved, the owner of the farm or plantation felt the work would go better. And I'm sure in some cases it did. So Josiah was the overseer on this farm. And the farm owner was running into financial difficulty, so he was moving some of his enslaved from Maryland to Kentucky. And he trusted Josiah to move them. And Josiah took his family with him as well. And so I used to think, well, why didn't they just mutiny on Josiah and run away? Well, this is when I realized when we're looking at history, we have to look at it from the year that these things are happening. Sure, it sounds really stupid that these people did mutiny on Josiah and run away to freedom, but not if you're living in that era. And we're talking the late 1820s. Slavery had been around for over 200 years by that point. So these people were conditioned to be enslaved people. I read a book once by a woman, it was her narrative, and she had been enslaved in Cambridge, Maryland, where Harriet Tubman's from. And she wanted the Confederate Army to win the Civil War because she said that that's why Black people were made, was to be enslaved. That's why that's what was their whole existence. And it sounds really stupid, I'm sure, doesn't it? But not if you're not if you this is what's become part of your DNA, is to be enslaved. You don't know anything else. You're living out in the country. So we have to look at history from the time that it happened. And I get some kickback sometimes when I'll say that slavery was around the world. It was like a commodity, like oil and gas is today. I'm not saying slavery is good. I'm not saying that at all. But that was how slavery was viewed back in the day. So we have to appreciate the time period when we discuss these various times in history. So the people that were with Josiah going off to Kentucky, of course, they wouldn't leave him because he'd make sure they were safe and taken care of. He'd always been good to them. So why wouldn't they follow him? But Josiah was offered his freedom while he was on the journey. Come, we'll take you to, people approached him and said, look, we'll take you to the Ohio River and we'll take you across the river and you can go free. And Josiah wouldn't do it because he was making a deal to purchase his freedom for himself and his family. He had also said he'd take these people to Kentucky for his massa boss. And that's exactly what he did. However, when he got to the plantation, and as things, first of all, he saw the plantation and saw how much worse the treatment was there than he had. And this is the man who saw his father's ear chopped off, but things were much worse at this plantation in Kentucky. And he thought, I should have gone ahead and escaped when I could. And then there was rumors. And then the other thing that happened is a lot of the people that were taken to Kentucky were being sold off to New Orleans. And rumor has it, the further south you went, the worse your treatment was. So Josiah had some regrets to not leaving and letting the others leave at that time when he first got there. And but he did decide to leave. Now, everyone I talk about today will have had some sort of injury, psychologically, mentally, emotionally. And Josiah wasn't any different. He had the emotional, psychological, but he also had a physical injury. During his time of slavery, he went through his hard times. His shoulder blades were broken. So he could never lift his arms up like this. He could only go like this. But he had 2 children that were going to be a part of his journey north, 4 and 7. And they weren't going to be able to walk from Maryland to Fort Erie very easily. And so what was he going to do? He was going to have to carry them, but he had these bad shoulders. He didn't use them as an excuse to not come to Canada. He decided, I'm going to figure out how to do this. So proud of this man. Incredible. And so he figured it out and he came to Canada. And we need to remember the journey too. We have a tendency to go, oh, follow the North Star, part of the Underground Railroad. We have a tendency to somewhat romanticize the journey of these people. Josiah arrived in Fort Erie in 1830, which was the beginning of the formal Underground Railroad system. And up until then, it was sort of a hodgepodge, if you will. It worked somehow, but and sometimes maybe it didn't. Not a lot of information there. But we don't know a lot about Josiah's journey, whether he was actually a part of the formal Underground Railroad, but we do know that he was given some assistance by the captain on the boat that brought him across the river. And he does say there were others that helped him, but he didn't strictly say Underground Railroad assistance. And so, but we like to talk about follow the North Star. Well, what did they do on a cloudy night? There wasn't a North Star. Look for the moss on the north side of the tree. Now that's information that Harriet Tubman had because her father had taught her how to follow the stars, and the mariners on the waterfront where that she sometimes frequented, they told her about follow the North Star. So she had information that people gave her, but not everyone would be privy to that kind of information. Some people would be told, follow a creek. Well, what if the creek dried up? And we often like to think that people traveled when the weather was beautiful. No, no. US Thanksgiving to New Year's. Right now, I don't know where everyone's located, but right here in North America, we're going through somewhat of a deep freeze. And so people may very well have left the South and started moving north and found themselves in a deep freeze without proper footwear or coats or what have you. Can you imagine? And some of them would die. Babies would die. It could be quite an incredible situation for people, but they were stubborn enough, if you will, faith-based enough, and had the courage to continue their journey to freedom. That's how much it meant to them to be free. So Josiah arrived here in 18. Here's the plaque that exists of him. This is the plaque at that site, and he arrived in 1830. He lived in Fort Erie for about a year and a half, but there was a settlement being developed where the museum is, the Uncle Tom's Cabin Museum in Dresden. They were establishing a place called Dawn Settlement. And so he wanted to go there because segregation wasn't a dirty word back then. It was what everybody thought was the best for everyone. We're going back that way, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I see, but that's a story for another day. Kind of negates everything people have done in the past, but I digress. Keep talking about the history for now. We can talk about the other later if you'd like. So he moved up to Dresden, took his family, and I used to wish he had stayed in Fort Erie, but he eloquently put it the way I put it, rather rudimentary. The people in Fort Erie were here, we's free, we's done. They weren't all that ambitious to establish a community and all that. And so he went where people thought more of the way along the lines he did. He fought in the rebellions of Upper Canada of 1837. He helped build the grist mill in the area. He was the preacher in the settlement. He did whatever he needed to do to make sure it survived and survived well. He also represented the community at a trade show in London, England. And by the way, he did Underground Railroad trips as well. He brought 118 people out of Maryland back into Canada. So we can applaud. A lot of people don't know that, but he also was part of it. Was an operator or a conductor on the Underground Railroad, bad shoulders and all, by the way, plus doing all these other things that he did. Just an amazing human being. So when the book was written in 1852, by that time, Queen Victoria had come to the crown. Slavery had been abolished throughout the British Empire as of 1834. No more slavery anywhere. Slave ships were stopped in 1807. Britain abolished the importations of enslaved people. But Queen Victoria did not, she had a lot of anti-slavery sentiments in her lifetime. So, and she had read the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they say she cried when she read the book. So when she heard that the true character that was used for the book was now in London, England, she wanted to meet him. And she did, of course. And it's funny, when he thought, because he read how she felt about slavery, he always thought that, well, he didn't read it, he couldn't read, but he was told about what she said about slavery, and he thought that she would have to be a Black woman. So he was quite surprised to find out that Queen Victoria was a white woman when he met her. And what a meeting that would have been, Queen Victoria and Josiah Henson. What an amazing moment. Anyway, he is a man that I certainly am proud of, and as all Blacks in Canada and whites can be proud of, our adopted Canadian citizen and all that he did. So I will tell people, and will continue to tell people, if you want to call me an Uncle Tom, go right ahead. I wear it as a badge of honor. Next slide. The next slide is the symbol that they came out with in the 70s. It was called the Running Man symbol. And the running, and some people are debating now whether it would be appropriate to have that as the running man, because if you, because if you use that, you wouldn't want to look like that. You didn't want to look like a running man. So they debate that now, but still this was the symbol, and a man by the name of Don Thompson made these and put them where we had Underground Railroad sites in Fort Erie at the time. And this again is the Niagara River. Looks awfully calm, doesn't it? That iron bridge that you see in the background is the other ferry landing on the US side in Buffalo. It's called Broderick Park, and they've allocated it also as an Underground Railroad sites with Canadian and US flags and some stones, walk stones that depict certain times in history. It's quite a lovely, they've done it very well on the US side. The Iron Bridge is a part of the Erie Canal. Some people were very fortunate in that they could ride on the Erie Canal. Remember, there were all kinds of other free Black folks around, so you could blend in and at certain times. Before we abolished slavery in Canada, Canada would extradite enslaved people. So you'd have bounty hunters on both sides of the border waiting for these boats to come in, and they'd be looking for their enslaved. But once we passed the Emancipation Proclamation, we no longer would extradite. Although there is a story about Solomon Mosby, a Black man, where they tried to bring him under the courts and arrested him for running away. But it was 1837. It's quite a convoluted story. He was in Niagara on the Lake. I may touch on it a bit later. There's so many stories to tell, folks. I could go on forever and days and weeks and months. There's just so many people. We talk about Harriet Tubman, and we're so blessed and honored that someone like her is the one that everyone knows first. But there's so many that were her contemporaries and in her lifetime, and that did so many things. There's so many that I'm proud. I'm so proud of my heritage. Anyway, the Erie Canal, there's some stories, William and Kate Harris and their harrowing story before they came into Canada and what happened to them on the Erie Canal. And it's quite a story. So there's stories on the Erie Canal that are shared. You can cycle the Erie Canal and read some of these stories. And there's a whole guide. I just got a box of them the other day from the Erie Canal Heritage Trailway that I'm going to be handing out to people. But there's all kinds of stories. So some people would take the Erie Canal and then they could hop on a boat and come to Canada and start their lives, this wilderness of Canada, if you will. We weren't very well developed back in those days. So the next site is when people would get off the boat here in Fort Erie, because this area is very close, they just basically had to almost run across the street and they'd be in a Black settlement. Now, I grew up knowing that area as Birdie Hill because it goes up a hill, and it would go like 3 or 4 blocks down the road. But my Uncle Kit, whom, if you remember, shared the stories with me that I share with you, had said it was actually called N Hill back in the day. It was a Black settlement. And this street here is called Lavinia Street. The reason it's called Lavinia Street is there was a woman by the name of Lavinia Taylor who lived on that street. She was well known in the community. I think she may have been because she was the chief trustee. They called her the chief trustee of the British Methodist Episcopal Church that existed in the neighborhood. British Methodist Episcopal Church churches were throughout Ontario, and were the churches that were built by freedom seekers when they came. Remember, church and community was very, very important to them. So they built these churches, and wherever there was one in Ontario, you knew there was a large population of Blacks, and Fort Erie wasn't any different. So she was the chief trustee of the church. Her family, more research needs to be done on her family, but her family may very well have gone back to the War of 1812, according to what my Uncle Kip had told me. And there's a story to tell about her family too, that I could share. So many stories. But anyway, she lived on that street. And then there was this next picture I'm going to show you of this handsome devil with the smile on his face. That man's name was William John Chandler. He was born in London, Ontario in 1841. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that's when Black men were allowed to fight in the Civil War. And a lot of people don't know this, but they blacks and whites from Canada would go and fight in this Civil War on the Confederate and Union side. William decided to fight on the Union side, I'm happy to share. So he went off to, there's some indication he may have been at Gettysburg, but we know he was in Florida. He fought in Florida, and if you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, I can't imagine how he survived this if this was his environment, but his arm was injured and they had to amputate it. Now remember, people, there wasn't anesthesia, there weren't proper amputation tools, there weren't antibiotics, but this man a Canadian, left Canada and fought in the Civil War. I think he deserves a monument myself, but fought in the Civil War in the United States and healed from those injuries and was able to make it back to Canada. He didn't go back to London because he met Lavinia Taylor and they married and lived on the street that eventually had her name. He was a taxi driver, which meant horse and buggy, and she took in laundry for white families in the area. And I'm telling you the story of my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather, and I'm so proud of both of them. And I actually grew up on Lavinia Street. And I've always made sure that people knew that the street was named after a Black woman. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I had an aha moment. It's like, Lezlie, how many people can say that they grew up on a street that was named after their great-grandma? So I take great pride in that. And I didn't always know about my great-grandpa having left Canada as a free Black man and fought in the Civil War. So I just adore him. And right now, that picture of myself with him in the picture, there's a military, as you can see, the military service of Black Canadians of the Niagara region. We have a Niagara Military Museum, primarily run by Jim and Kathy Doherty, and they worked with Wilma Morrison to help put this military exhibit together, which is now I'm so proud to say, at the Canada War Museum as part of the Community at War exhibit. And there's been deadlines that come up, and every time there's a deadline come up, can it not become part of the permanent? Like, that's something we have to work on in Canada. We have a tendency to put up our exhibits of other groups of people and then we take them down. I want this one to stay up. And of course, it's my own bias, of course, because when you walk into the exhibition hall that they have in Ottawa, my great grandpa is the first one in the exhibit. So I'm really proud to see him there. And so they've now, it was supposed to come down in December. Now they've extended it until September. So I'll be writing them again in August to ask them to extend it again. But I also have another relative that was part of the military. In Canada, there's been a lot of talk about the 2nd Battalion of the First World War of Black soldiers who were not treated well during World War I. But I'm here to tell you the other story. And it's about this gentleman here named John Bright. John Bright is an ancestral cousin of mine. And when I finish the story, you'll understand why I'm so proud of him. He is also a part of the exhibit in Ottawa. He was from Fort Erie. And I don't know how it happened, but somehow he was brought in to protect the Welland Canal. They had to, when World War I broke out, they felt it was important to protect the Welland Canal. So you can imagine the chaos, and it insisted that they had to project the Welland Canal on this side of the ocean. So anyway, he was at the Welland Canal, and then he ended up in London, England, and got caught in some rubble during a battle, and ended up having broken ribs, and he was in a hospital for a year. He recovered, and when you have broken ribs back in those days, there weren't a lot of things they could do for you. But he managed to recover, and he was one of the soldiers that fought at one of our famous battles of World War I for Canadians. He fought at Passchendaele. There's a movie that's been produced about Passchendaele, and he was one of the soldiers at Passchendaele. He also is only one of 6 Black soldiers who participated in World War I to receive a Medal of Courage, a silver Medal of Courage, my ancestral cousin. And he's also a part of this exhibit, which I will continue to, as Frederick Douglass used to say, agitate, agitate, agitate. So I will continue to agitate, agitate, agitate the Canada War Museum to keep John Bright's information and history up at the museum as well.
Lezlie, I'm going to agitate for a moment. We got about 10 minutes left. So
No,
you have some important content to
no.
get in.
Oh no. Well, you'll have to have me back because I'm still in Fort Erie. I haven't even gone to St. Catharines yet. Anyway, folks, there's so much history here. I'll do this as fast as I can. But when Uncle Kit would talk about the sites in Fort Erie, and this is this is okay because this is the last site that he told my mother and I about. It wasn't like I came from one of those Hallmark card families where you sit by the hearth at Grandpa's knee and they tell you stories. He'd be sitting in the house somewhere and something would pop into his head and he'd go, there's that old cemetery out there off Richmount Road. I go, what? He go, there's that old cemetery, colored cemetery off Richmount Road. And I'd be like, oh, okay. So I said, Uncle Kit, didn't procrastinate. I said, Uncle Kit, take Mom and I out and show us that cemetery. So we got in my car and nothing was wrong with his mind. And he brought us out to this cemetery where it was all overgrown fence. Nobody was paying attention to this piece of property. Uncle Kit told us the property was owned by the Sisler family. And they gave it out to Blacks to bury their dead because it was a segregated cemetery. So sadly, people believe it was segregated by color, which it's not. And for you War of 1812 buffs, and the reason I know that is because Uncle Kit, at the same time he told us about Blacks being buried there, War of 1812 vets are also buried in this cemetery, and they would have been white. So it was segregated not by race, but by religion. Around the corner from this cemetery is an Anglican church, St. John's Anglican Church. And they were there to assist the people because this is the area I call Niagara Park says that Little Africa was further down by the river. And if that's the case, boy, that was a huge, huge community because it covers a lot of area. But I say Little Africa existed by this cemetery. And the other part of it is that when we were driving out to the cemetery, Uncle Kit said, Uncle Tom used to live there. And he was pointing to a bunch of trees and woods beside the church. And I just thought it was an ambiguous, you lived in the area. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it at the time. But I received a letter from some historians from the St. John's Anglican Church. And you know what it said? Josiah Henson lived next door to the church. So even that small detail was covered in oral history by my great uncle. It was thrilling to get that information. So I'm moving along. So anyway, here's all the other stones were flat. And this one was different because it's square. See how it's square? It's a different kind of stone. And I had a tourism colleague who's traveled all over the world visit me this summer, and I took Stephen out to show him this cemetery. And he said, this stone, like I told him, I said, it's different than the others. He said, yeah. He said, in Scotland, stones like this would be put in place for the preacher of the church. And he said, and at the top of the stone, it would say Holy Bible. And sometimes you can read on that when it says Holy Bible, and sometimes you can't read it. And you couldn't read it that day. And I said, oh, but it does say Holy Bible on this one sometimes. He said, well, this person could very well have been the preacher. Well, you can imagine my excitement because that stone was the one that Mom and Uncle Kit and myself were drawn to when we first came to the cemetery. And lo and behold, it's the cemetery of ancestors. I was remiss in telling you that when my family came from Kentucky as freedom seekers, 2 brothers and a 9-year-old sister. I'm a descendant of Jack Bright. Sylvester was the other brother, and it's Sylvester and his family members that are buried there. Now, at one point in the journey of those 3, they had fallen asleep. They heard a noise, and something woke the boys up and they ran like a shot, a quarter of a mile. And then they realized they had left their 9-year-old sister sleeping in a log. Well, it frightened them so badly. And they thought, but then they thought, oh my gosh, we've forgotten our baby sister. And rather than say, what are we going to do? We can't go get her. I'm so proud to tell you, those young boys went back, got their baby sister, and the 3 of them arrived in Fort Erie, as is evidenced by Sylvester being buried at that cemetery. So more research needs to be investigated, but it looks like my ancestor, Sylvester Bright, was the preacher in the area that was known as Little Africa, where this cemetery is. Then if you'll just indulge me a couple more minutes, please, I have to tell you this one site that and oftentimes this is a prize for people. On Lake Erie, by the beach, there's a site where a civil rights meeting took place. Many people thought, stay out of the white man's business, Booker T. Washington, get a skill, do that. Another man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois said, I want more. He wrote in a book called The Souls of Black Folks. W.E.B. Du Bois got his PhD from Harvard, and we could think about what it would be like to be a Black man and present your argument for your dissertation by color. Can't imagine what that was like, but there were many Blacks who felt education was super important and would have done the same thing he did. And in his book, Souls of Black Folk, he wrote, I don't want these people to just be Negroes. I want them to be American. So he fought and brought in people that thought the way he did, Blacks, whites, men, women. And the group was called the Niagara Movement. And of course, Google say, couldn't get or Wikipedia might say, couldn't get a room in Buffalo, so they had to come to Canada. No, they wanted to, because at that time there was an amusement park built by these wealthy Americans called Canada's $2 million playground. It consisted of a roller coaster, a 3,500 person stadium, a zoo, a midway, hotels, restaurants, the world's largest swimming pool, a 3-story dance hall, quite the enterprise. It was one of the first amusement parks in North America, for sure. Quite a popular place. So, of course, he wanted to bring people there and have them discuss their issues, which they did. And at the end of the 2, they spent one night at Mary Tolbert's house in Buffalo. She was also a member of the group, as well as president of the National Negro Women's Council and part of the anti-lynching committee. But she also hosted 29 of them in her home in Buffalo. But at that time, you didn't have to have an ensuite for all of your guests. You could just have a piece of floor. And if there was a piece of carpet on it, that made it a suite. And they stayed with her for one night and then came to Fort Erie for 2 nights because W.E.B. wanted them to be in an environment that he felt would be a little more comfortable anyway, where they could discuss their issues. And at the end of their 2 days there, they came up with a resolution to start a civil rights organization. And 4 years later in New York City was the founding meeting of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And we as Canadians can be very proud that the founding of the formalization of civil rights, not just for Blacks, but for everyone, started here in Canada. So this is why I celebrate Black History Month, because there's so much. And I just have to run through now because you won't let me go on for hours. Maybe you'll have me back again someday and I can finish the rest of the story. But my Uncle Kit, he was the last of the siblings. There was Aunt Mark and Uncle Kit left in my family, and they're both in their 90s. And Aunt Mark passed away one night. I went to see Uncle Kit the next day. And I said, Uncle Kit, I have some bad news for you this morning. And he said, you do? What is it? And I said, well, Aunt Mark passed last night. And he said, she did, poor thing. What happened to her? I'm like, whoa, she's in her 90s. And I was like, I said, well, I guess she just gave up. He became really upset with the words I said. He said, what do you mean she gave up? You don't give up. You keep going till you can't go no more. Okay. He passed away a few months later, but when I started doing my tours in 2004, I guess it was, I remembered what he told me. That's why I can do it verbatim, because Black history here in Canada the Blacks that lived here, the Canadians that lived here, were people who didn't give up. They kept moving forward no matter what was happening, and had tremendous successes in spite of the fact that people didn't like them, fought in wars when the country they lived in didn't want them, fought in wars in other countries to protect the freedoms that they had here. That's who I'm from. That's whose legacy I continue to talk about. And that's why I celebrate Canadian Black History Month. So thank you, and go out there and enjoy Black History Month. And I really would appreciate questions.
Well, thank you, Lezlie. I think Chris usually has a few of his own to get things started, and we're seeing favorable comments in the chat, and already a request saying yes, they want to see more of your talk or get more information from you. So well done. It's I don't know how many times we've stayed at old Fort Erie, and I think the one morning I was up early and took a walk down the lakeshore and come across the ruins of that amusement park. It's quite surreal to walk around and see all the concrete footings and the remnants of that. It must have been quite the place.
Oh, can you imagine? And at the turn of the century, Fort Erie not only had that place, but they also had the racetrack as well. Quite a going concern, I would suggest, from a tourism point of view at the turn of the 20th century, for sure. But, to know that W.E.B. Du Bois was actually in Fort Erie. W.E.B. Du Bois was in Fort Erie. And one of the participants in the Niagara movement was also Canadian, by the way.
Interesting. The cemetery, you said when you were first there, it was in quite a state of ruin. Has someone been restoring it and bringing it back?
What happened was a few months after Uncle Kit, after we had been out there, Uncle Kit was interviewed by a friend of mine who was working at the paper in Fort Erie at the time. And he talked about the cemetery in the article. And then the Fort Erie Cemetery Board took it over. And it wasn't that great a job in the beginning, but I got to tell you, as of 2012, when the Canadian Veterans Association went in there and marked the soldiers that are there from the War of 1812, they all have little plaques in the grass now. Since they've done that, I'll tell you, they cut that grass on a regular basis. It's looking rather spiffy all the time now. So.
Well, I make a point of going to find it and have a look myself when the snow's falling. So
yeah, for sure.
I'm going to jump in too, Lezlie. Thank you so much. This is, it's always fascinating hearing about history, but there's something special when somebody's talking about their own family history and just, like you say, just the pride that you bring to it and the celebration of your own history. So that's fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to put a call out again to our chat. I've said it a few times, but I'll say it again to the people in the chat. Please post questions. If you've got any, Lezlie would love to hear from you. She was asking for questions earlier, so please, we'd love to hear one.
Nobody asked a question. Nobody wants to know what it's like to be the only Black kid in your school and everybody's white. I'm happy to talk about the anti-racism issue as well. This is your opportunity.
Well, let me start with a bit of a leading question, Lezlie. You certainly referred to Black History Month throughout your talk, and I've heard different stories. So different opinions, and I'd really love to hear your personal take, just on how important is Black History Month to you personally?
Excuse me. For me personally, to have grown up as a Black kid in Fort Erie who felt rather insignificant, there were times when I wished I had blonde hair and blue eyes because I just didn't feel I mattered. And unfortunately, I didn't come from a family where they felt they really mattered. I mean, I love my family. I appreciate them, but you don't realize what people are going through until later. And it was difficult. And the insignificance of me going through life not being my family not being recognized, our history not being recognized. I like Black History Month now because I do my tours primarily for Black. It really came about because of Black kids that, and what I was hearing in Toronto, and how Canada is a racist country. You're not in the textbooks, you're not in the history books, and I'm like, whoa, not a good message here. And also it was, and that's when I would tell people, I tell them on my tours, we weren't in the textbooks, we weren't in the history books. We came to Canada, as many of us, as freedom seekers, and it was the white man's government. We were afraid of the white man. We wanted to stay out of his way. My family, as well as many other families, had their family Bibles. Many of them knew their own history. But why would we think that our history would would be a part of the white man's history in Canada? It was other than First Nations and French, and I think we're the fourth host. Toronto Board, I loved it. There was a man at the Toronto Board of Ed that said that Blacks in Canada were a host culture. I always liked that because we were one of the first groups to come into Canada. So First Nations were here, but they weren't governing, if you will, at the time. So why would we even think that would be something we'd even think about? And then I'll apologize to those that don't see us in textbooks, because part of it's on us. And I said, we didn't appreciate the fact that our history, as crazy as it sounds now, would be a part of the rest of the Canadian history. It just, at that time, it just didn't make sense. So Black history for me, to be able to share with these poor kids, particularly in Toronto, who are getting a message that I just think just makes me crazy. Black kids are told they're racialized. Don't call me racialized, by the way. I'm not a victim. Yeah, I've had difficulties because of circumstances in my environment, but if you had told me that I was racialized back in the days when I had my struggles, that's enough to make you want to give up. That's not a word of encouragement or inspiration. And then poor white kids are told that their race is a horrible race of people. That's difficult. So by having the opportunity I have to talk and celebrate Black history, I hope it helps our kids, because they're the ones that are hearing all this adult hate speech from both sides all the time, not necessarily coming from a household where they sit and have good conversations. A lot of these kids come home and there's no one to talk to. I recently was invited to Buffalo to do a tour for consultants that they brought in from outside of New York State to see what they can do about development on the east side of Buffalo, where in May of last year, there's one major supermarket on the east side of Buffalo, and it's called Tops Market for those of you outside of North America. And so it was a well-used grocery store. And this young man from Pennsylvania came in to Buffalo with his shotgun and shot and killed 10 people in that grocery store. Devastating for Buffalo. So I was brought in to show the consultants, do a tour about regular Buffalo and a little bit about the east side. And then there were Black community leaders from Buffalo that did showed the east side of Buffalo and where they really needed to put some dollars and some improvement. And that, to me, that situation that happened in Buffalo is a good example. Here's this white kid who's being fed all this stuff, and who knows what his background is, but I suspect not a family that had Hallmark card moments either. And then you've got Black kids in Toronto that have been told Canada doesn't like them. And where do I see them? At the Roy McMurtry Center, which is our federal facility for young offenders, because these young offenders have joined gangs and they shoot each other. So this is why Black history is so important. But what we talk about during Black history is also important. And that's why I'm happy to bring the happy and celebratory and hopefully inspirational side of Black history to people. I know, a long-winded answer, wasn't it?
That was fantastic. Thank you. And just because you mentioned your tours a few times, I will highlight to people, Tom and Lezlie and I will have a conversation about when and if hopefully we can find a time to get her back to tell more of these stories. But don't forget, you can always, if you're anywhere near Niagara, you can always go see Lezlie, and book a tour
Yes.
with her. I'm sure she'd be just as happy to have you there as well. So,
I love
hopefully,
showing it I love showing these sites in person, that's for sure.
yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully some people take you up on that based
Hope
on your
so. Thank
conversations
you.
today.
Thank
Um,
you.
so a question sort of um, more about you than your family. Have you found more recently that oral histories have become um, not even more acceptable, but more people have started to see the importance of oral histories now as sort of professional historians. They're really valuing that as history. Have you found that changed more recently?
Well, that's an interesting, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I'm having a difficult time now when I see that, like Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm not consulted. And it was interesting. Last week, there was a woman out of Southwestern Ontario that spoke at the Ontario Black History Society brunch, and she brought this exact subject up. Although we're grateful that various government institutions want to look at our history, we asked, this woman literally asked that the government and these historical researchers reach out to us, the authentic Black Canadians with real history and real roots in the history, also be involved. Because as this woman said, Elise Harding Davis is her name, she said, we have familiar family information that we also could add to the stories, but we aren't asked. And when I find that there's things that I question, that they've hired these historical researchers, and oftentimes these historical researchers have been blessed to have the education, but they don't have the deep roots that I have, or that Elise would have, or others might have for this country. So that's where they take out terms like Uncle Tom from Uncle Tom's Cabin Museum, or in the situation of Niagara on the Lake. If you come to Niagara on the Lake, on the main road coming in, there's if you happen to glance over, you'll see there's one of those provincial plaques, and it says Negro Burial Ground. Well, they decided to put up a new plaque and change the name of Negro Burial Ground because these people that are doing the updating of the history don't like the word Negro. Well, you know what? Those of us who've been here a long time don't mind the word Negro. And that's throughout North America. We wouldn't call certain things, we wouldn't label them with words we didn't like. For instance, United Negro Scholarship Fund. Some people don't like color. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Those are names that we're comfortable with. Negro is a derivative of the Spanish word black. So that's why that's appropriate, but that's what happens. So even when there was a man who was at the same time they were changing the name of the plaque in Niagara on the Lake, he was doing research on that burial ground, having driven past it for many, many years, decided, I'm going to do some research on this. And he did do some research on it. And he didn't have any, and they still, apparently the plaque's ready to roll. And I was supposed to go in June, but there was enough pushback on this that they haven't put it up yet. And I suspect they'll probably quietly put it up anyway one day. But he did what they call it now is the Niagara Baptist Church Burial Ground, which doesn't tell anybody anything if you're driving by. And this man did his research. He's not a PhD or anything, but he did his research and found out that the Baptist church doesn't even have any records of a church ever existing on that site. And there's also indications, and there's also, so that would be a main indication. Like here you have these historical researchers that are the ones that are hired as the authorities just because their skin is the same color, being the authorities now on Black history. But it's a different perspective. Like, something I'm going to add to this now is there's no such thing as a Black community. We're all different. I remember years ago, someone said maybe we should have been called the African diasporas instead of the African diaspora, because once we left those African shores, we all had different experiences. And we are different. I know I'm different from people from the Caribbean, and Caribbeans might be different than some people from Africa because we've all had different experiences. I share a lot with my US brothers and sisters, but there's still some differences because of the experiences we've had. So I do
Lezlie,
feel somewhat shunned in a way. Yeah.
it's a shame you feel that. I'm going to close this with one last question because remarkably, Chris and I got another meeting to get to shortly.
Okay.
But a question in the chat, Sandra was asking, what would you recommend for further reading?
Start with Uncle Tom's Cabin for sure. And if you want to read about Harriet Tubman, who's one of the most famous, I suggest Bound for Canaan, is it? By Kate Clifford Larson. I'm not sure of the title, but the name of the author is by Kate Clifford Larson. So those are the two books off the top of my head I can highly recommend. And then, of course, Frederick Douglass's book. There's tons of books, and my information is available through my website, niagaraboundtours.com. And I'd be happy, Sandra, to send you a few other titles if you'd like.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Lezlie, and really appreciate you joining us today and sharing yours and your family's experiences. It was a fascinating talk. We really appreciate that. So,
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.